crowd asked John, "What should we do?" Who was John the Baptist? What was his relationship to Jesus? Think about it for a second. What do you actually know about John the Baptist? What do you know about his message? Oh wait, think about it. What we learn about John the Baptist from the Gospels was that he was the forerunner. He was the path clearer for Jesus. Later on, we learn that he had some disciples of his own, but for the most part, after Jesus' baptism in the Jordan, the rest of John's story takes place off stage. He set the scene and then disappears. As it happens, John had a life and ministry of his own. Among other things, he was preaching and prophesying a message of repentance and renewal, inviting the people to ritually re-enter the Promised Land, crossing over the Jordan again to begin their life as God's people anew. Looking about him at the state of his people under imperial occupation, John was trying to prepare his brothers and sisters for the inevitable wrath and destruction that would come on Rome and on Rome's collaborators during the final days. And so what is so interesting about the scene that we have set for us today is who it is who has shown up for John's baptism. Who would you expect to show up to a revival, a rabble-rousing, unwashed ranter in the desert? Who would you expect to show up to that? The baptism was a kind of cleaning as well as a re-entry. It was a washing away of what had been and an opportunity to start something new. It was a way of delineating that was then and this is now. It was a re-entry into the land, the life that had been given to them by God in the covenant with Moses. It was a way of re-establishing themselves as the kind of people that God had made them to be. Rome's occupation of that land had been going on for generations by this point. There were many people whose livelihoods were bound up in this province's relationship with the military government. Rome needed tax collectors and security patrols to keep the locals in line, and it would work best if those were local people themselves. And so, like collaborators in all times, these tax collectors and soldiers were not really popular with the rest of the locals. And the soldiers and the tax collectors had power. They had power that they had borrowed from the empire. And they were making their living out of their sisters and brothers, using that power. Tax collectors could use it to take more than they owed back to Rome, make a little on the side. Soldiers could use that borrowed power to make the locals carry their stuff for them. They could use it to extort bribes. And so it's these soldiers and tax collectors, among the rest of the populace, who have shown up for John's baptism. It is these who have come down from the city to re-establish themselves as God's people, to reassure themselves that they are still the people that they were born to be. Because if the reckoning was indeed coming, they wanted to be on the right side when it came. They wanted to make right. So how to do that? John preaches an ethical standard that I think we can all get behind. Treat other people like they're people. Your sisters and brothers are not a means to enrich yourself. They're vulnerable. Some of them are naked. Instead of exploiting them, take care of them. This is basic. And for John, failing to offer this fundamental level of human decency to your neighbors was so offensive, so counter to God's purposes, that it could only incur God's wrath. That righteous anger and judgment that comes on anyone who stands in God's way or who maltreats God's people. Clean up, fix yourself, stop associating with the enemy, stop treating your neighbors badly, shape up, or else. Or else what? John preached a reckoning. He shouted the message that the final account is coming, and you had better measure up. But that reckoning never came. John foretold a Messiah who would come with fire, who would burn the chaff and gather up the wheat into his granary. Better do right, or the furnace for you, he said. But that Messiah never shows up. In the very next passage of Luke's gospel, the Messiah comes. Jesus comes to the river to be baptized. And he begins his ministry with John's message of repentance, change of life. But he doesn't bring fire. He doesn't bring vengeance. He doesn't bring payment for the wrongs that have been perpetrated by those in power. He doesn't knock heads together and send the enemies of the people of Israel packing away ashamed. Instead, this Messiah for whom John had prepared begins his work by crossing into the desert to be tempted, to confront the power that he can freely exercise, and to say no. No military power, no political control. And having crossed over with the tax collectors and the soldiers into the land of his ancestors, Jesus, this Messiah, offers a different way. For generations, scholars have suggested that John was a kind of mentor or teacher of Jesus. Perhaps Jesus was one of John's disciples before he struck out on his own. Makes sense. Jesus' teaching builds on John's in a way, takes up where John left off, preaching repentance. Jesus' later teaching would emphasize much of John's ethical program. We must treat others as the fully alive, fully human people that they are. And this does call for repentance. It does call for a change of life. We can't go on living as though God's desire for the world doesn't matter. We can't go on living as though other people's lives don't matter. Only Jesus leaves out the wrath. Jesus opts against a God who comes bringing punishment and fire. Instead, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection point us to a God who instead bears our wrath. A God who puts herself in the way of the worst punishment we have to offer. It's not to avoid the wrath that we are called to love one another, to love strangers and friends. It is because it is what God is doing all the time, offering herself to the world. And so we are invited to offer ourselves to one another. More than a political leader who would drive away the enemies of God's faithful people, the Messiah for whom John had prepared comes in solidarity with all vulnerable people, all whose lives are overwhelmed by the powers of the world. The Messiah was supposed to come and make everything okay. Instead, God came and got with us into the mess. Because that's the big difference between the Messiah that we might want, the powerful one who will come and drive away our enemies and fix all our problems, and the Messiah that we get, one who shows up and joins us in the midst of our confusion and vulnerability, and invites us to join with him in making everything new. Everyone is invited, even the tax collectors, even the soldiers. Nobody is left out. Nobody has to do more or pay more or earn more. Because the Messiah that we got is God herself, here and now, inviting us to join with her in making peace between all people. Every week, we go from here to the table. We share the bread and wine, which are Christ's body and blood. As St. Augustine said, in sharing that body and blood, we become what we receive. The Messiah that we received invites us to become the very acts of peace and reconciliation for which we have been hoping. There's no deserving it. There's no earning it. There's only the watching and the waiting, the turning around and the letting go, the following and the recognition that Christ is here, now, making peace among us and among all people. What shall we do?